You ever deal with people who think their little bit of authority makes them king of the world? Yeah, me too. But mine wasn't just some keyboard warrior or petty bureaucrat. Mine was an HOA president, let's call him Peterson, who decided his power extended beyond the cookie-cutter kingdom he ruled, right onto my property. And not just onto the lawn, oh no. He and his crony decided to play cop and break into my locked barn. What they didn't factor into their little power play was what was waiting inside. 5 Charolais bulls, adding up to about 15,000 pounds of extremely unimpressed, suddenly disturbed beef on the hoof. If you like stories about petty tyrants getting exactly what they deserve, stick around, because this one involves trespassing, property destruction, terrified HOA officials, and the beautiful, simple physics of very large, very annoyed farm animals. Drop a comment. If you've ever had an HOA nightmare, you'll appreciate where this went. My property isn't actually in the Serenity Meadows Homeowners Association development. It borders it. I bought the acreage specifically because it wasn't part of an HOA. I wanted space, privacy, the freedom to have a slightly imperfect lawn without getting passive-aggressive notices slipped under my door, and crucially, the ability to run my small-scale cattle operation without seeking approval from a committee concerned about matching mailbox colors. My land backs onto their designated natural buffer zone, which is basically a strip of patchy grass and neglected saplings they rarely maintain but frequently worry about. My barn sits maybe 50 yards from that property line, an old, sturdy structure, weathered but solid, that I use for equipment storage and, importantly, for housing my 5 breeding bulls. They're big boys, mostly gentle giants in their element, but like any animal that weighs as much as a small car, they command respect and don't appreciate surprises. I made sure my fencing was impeccable, not just county code compliant, but genuinely secure. And I had no trespassing signs posted prominently along the property line shared with the HOA land, clear, professional signs, not just scribbled notes. You couldn't miss them unless you were deliberately trying to. From the beginning, President Peterson, a man whose personality seemed inversely proportional to his actual authority, viewed my property as an irritating deviation from the beige uniformity he enforced within Serenity Meadows. The first signs of trouble were minor, almost laughable. An email forwarded via a slightly embarrassed-sounding HOA secretary complaining that the color of my fence facing their buffer zone wasn't harmonious with the community's aesthetic guidelines. I politely replied, pointing out that my property wasn't subject to their guidelines, and the fence was entirely on my land. Peterson himself then sent a registered letter demanding I trim a stand of oak trees on my property because they supposedly cast too much shade on a corner of their rarely used common area picnic spot in the late afternoon. Again, I politely declined, citing property rights and suggesting they plant shade-tolerant flowers if it was such a concern. Peterson seemed constitutionally incapable of understanding where his authority ended. I remember one Saturday morning, finding him standing just on his side of the property line, clipboard in hand, peering intently at my tractor shed. He actually waved me over. Just conducting a visual assessment, he announced, puffing his chest out. Need to ensure structures adjacent to the community meet certain visual standards. I reminded him, firmly but still politely, that he had absolutely no jurisdiction over my property. My visual standards are my business, Peterson. Your HOA rules stop at that fence line. He retorted something about protecting property values for his residents, implying my rustic barn was somehow dragging down the resale value of houses half a mile away. I just shook my head and went back to my chores, making a mental note that this guy wasn't just a stickler. He had a genuine Napoleon complex. He truly seemed to believe that his elected position in a suburban homeowners association gave him quasi-governmental powers over anyone within his line of sight. The bulls were mostly just background noise at this point, their occasional bellows echoing harmlessly. Little did I know they were destined to become central figures in Peterson's unfolding drama. My desire was simply to be left alone, to enjoy the peace I'd sought. Peterson's desire, apparently, was to extend his beige tentacles of conformity over everything he could see. The contrast couldn't have been starker. His world of manicured lawns and identical mailboxes, and mine, a place of working land, actual nature, and yes, very large animals that served a purpose beyond just existing quietly. Whispers started, relayed by a neighbor I was friendly with inside the HOA. Peterson was telling people the farm smells were drifting over, impossible given prevailing winds and distance, that the bull noises were disruptive, painting me as an uncooperative outsider, deliberately blighting their suburban utopia. The stage was being meticulously set, not by me, but by a man whose ego vastly exceeded his reach. The focus of Peterson's obsession soon narrowed laser-like onto my barn. The polite emails and registered letters took on a sharper, more officio tone. Suddenly, my perfectly legal, agriculturally zoned barn was an unapproved outbuilding, creating an aesthetic nuisance. This, despite it being there decades before Serenity Meadows was even a blueprint. He cited bylaws that, even with the most generous interpretation, clearly only applied to structures within the HOA's boundaries. I continued to respond factually, referencing county records, zoning ordinances, and the deed to my property, which clearly outlined the lines of demarcation. My politeness was wearing thin, replaced by a growing irritation at having to continually defend my rights against this bureaucratic mosquito. Peterson, undeterred by facts or law, escalated. He announced the formation of a new subcommittee, the Community Adjacency Standards Committee, which sounded grand but consisted solely of himself and his primary sycophant, Bernard. Bernard was the type of guy who probably enjoyed handing out parking tickets, if given half a chance. Being Peterson's right-hand man was likely the peak of his life's achievements. Their official duty? To monitor and report on properties bordering Serenity Meadows that might negatively impact the community's character or safety. In reality, this meant Peterson and Bernard started spending an unhealthy amount of time lurking near my property line. I'd see them standing there, sometimes with binoculars, pointing towards my barn, sometimes towards the pasture where the bulls grazed peacefully. It went from irritating to downright creepy. I started feeling harassed, constantly watched. I made sure my no trespassing signs were freshly cleaned and perfectly upright. I documented their surveillance activities with my phone camera whenever I caught them, just establishing a pattern. One afternoon, they were bolder. They were right at the fence, Peterson gesturing emphatically towards the barn, Bernard nodding vigorously. I walked over. "Find something interesting, gentlemen?" I asked, keeping my voice level. Peterson launched into a pre-rehearsed speech about concerns regarding the structural integrity of my barn, claiming it posed a potential risk if it collapsed towards HOA property, a physical impossibility given the distance and terrain. He then segued into renewed complaints about the bulls. Those enormous creatures, he called them, are frankly intimidating to our residents using the nature trail. He demanded access to my property, specifically the barn, to conduct a safety inspection. Bernard chimed in, "It's just a precaution for everyone's safety." I flatly refused. "Peterson, we've been over this. You have no authority here. This is private property. My barn's integrity is checked regularly, and it's none of your business. My bulls are securely contained on my land, far from your trail. You are not coming onto my property." I decided to record this conversation openly, holding my phone up. "And for the record, I am recording this refusal and your continued attempts to assert authority where you have none." Peterson sputtered, face turning red. "This is unacceptable. Your lack of cooperation forces us to consider other avenues. We may have to report this to higher authorities." It was pure bluster. I knew he had nothing. I'd already preemptively checked with county code enforcement after his first barn complaint. They confirmed I was fully compliant with all regulations, including agricultural zoning. "You do whatever you feel you need to do, Peterson," I said calmly, "but stay off my property." They retreated, muttering threats about bylaws and community safety. Later that week, my friendly HOA neighbor told me Peterson held a special information session for residents. painting a lurid picture of my dilapidated barn, potentially collapsing onto playing children who never played near there, and my vicious bulls plotting prison breaks to terrorize Serenity Meadows. He was actively manufacturing consent for, well, I wasn't sure what yet, but it clearly involved overstepping boundaries in a big way. I meticulously saved copies of his threatening letters, the photos of him and Bernard snooping, the audio recording of our fence line confrontation. I felt like I was building a case file, though I hoped I'd never need it. The irony was thick. I bought land away from an HOA to avoid exactly this kind of petty tyranny, only to have it bleed over the property line anyway, driven by one man's inflated sense of importance and his sidekick's eagerness to please. The tension was palpable now, no longer just background noise but a constant, low-level hum of conflict waiting to ignite. The ignition point came on a Tuesday afternoon. I'd driven into town for a couple of hours to pick up fencing supplies and grab lunch. Everything seemed normal when I left. The bulls were lounging in their pasture. The barn was securely locked. Peterson and Bernard were nowhere in sight. I returned around 3 p.m., pulling my truck up the gravel drive towards the barn. Something felt off immediately. The heavy-duty, weatherproof padlock I used on the main sliding barn door wasn't hanging in its usual place. I got out of the truck, heart starting to pound a little faster. As I got closer, I saw it. The thick shackle of the padlock was bent, mangled, lying uselessly on the dusty ground just outside the door. My eyes shot to the door itself. Fresh, deep scratches and gouges scarred the wood around the hasp, clear evidence of a pry bar or similar tool being used to force it open. Someone had deliberately broken into my barn. My first thought wasn't even about Peterson. It was pure cold fury mixed with a shot of adrenaline-fueled worry. The bulls, were they hurt? Had they gotten loose? I slid the big door open. It protested slightly, likely warped from the force used to break the lock. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stressed livestock. The 5 bulls weren't loose, thank God. They were still in their individual heavy-duty stalls, but they were far from calm. Usually placid creatures, they were now pacing restlessly, whites of their eyes showing, heads tossing. One had kicked at his stall door hard enough to splinter a board. Another was huffing loudly, a low guttural sound of agitation. Something, or someone, had clearly spooked them badly. I quickly checked each animal. No visible injuries, just highly agitated. The stalls were intact, other than the one splintered board. But there were signs of panic, disturbed bedding kicked high against the walls, a water bucket overturned. Nothing seemed obviously stolen. My chainsaw, tools, and bags of feed were all accounted for. This wasn't a theft. This was something else. This was an intrusion. My mind immediately flashed to Peterson and Bernard, their escalating harassment, their demands for inspection, their veiled threats. The timing, the method, the lack of theft, it all pointed straight back to Serenity Meadows. I stepped back outside, scanning the ground meticulously. Near the damaged door, I found distinct footprints in the dust, multiple sets. Some looked like standard work boots, but others looked suspiciously like the loafers Bernard always wore. More importantly, near the edge of my property line, closest to the HOA's buffer zone, I spotted faint but discernible tire tracks in a patch of damp earth. Tracks that hadn't been there when I left. Tracks leading directly back towards the pristine pavement of the HOA development. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. They'd actually done it. They'd trespassed, broken my lock, and entered my barn. The audacity was breathtaking. My anger began to solidify into cold resolve. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was criminal activity. I immediately pulled out my phone and dialed the sheriff's department, reporting a breaking and entering and vandalism. While waiting, I took dozens of photos. The broken lock from multiple angles, the damage to the doorframe, the disturbed interior of the barn, the footprints, the tire tracks, evidence. A deputy arrived about 30 minutes later. He was professional, took detailed notes, photographed the damage himself, and examined the tracks. He listened patiently as I recounted the ongoing issues with Peterson and the HOA, emphasizing their recent demands to inspect the barn and my refusal. I didn't make accusations, just laid out the facts and the pattern of behavior. He agreed the circumstances were highly suspicious, especially the lack of theft. Happens sometimes, he said wryly. Folks in HOAs get territorial, think their rules apply everywhere. He gave me a report number and advised installing security cameras immediately. Best deterrent there is, he noted before leaving. As his cruiser disappeared down the drive, I stood there staring at my violated barn, the image of those arrogant little men breaking in playing in my mind. The feeling of vulnerability was quickly being replaced by a burning sense of indignation. They hadn't just crossed a property line, they'd crossed a fundamental line of decency and law. Okay, Peterson, I thought. You wanted to escalate? Fine, let's escalate. But you're not going to like where it ends. The suburban grapevine works with astonishing speed, especially when fueled by minor injury and major embarrassment. Less than 2 hours after the deputy left, my friendly HOA neighbor called, her voice a mix of conspiracy and concern. You will not believe this, she started. Apparently, Peterson and Bernard had made quite the spectacle of themselves returning to the Serenity Meadows clubhouse earlier that afternoon. Bernard, she reported gleefully, was sporting a noticeable limp. His normally immaculate chinos were ripped at the knee, and he seemed unable to put his full weight on one ankle. Peterson looked less physically damaged, but was described as apoplectic. His face beat red, twigs in his hair, and a long scratch down his cheek. They'd immediately retreated into Peterson's house, but not before several residents witnessed their disheveled state. The official story, already being spun by Peterson via frantic emails to the board, which my neighbor had been copied on, mistakenly or intentionally, was that they were conducting a routine perimeter inspection near the problematic adjacent property when they were unexpectedly confronted by aggressive livestock that appeared to have breached containment near the fence line. They claimed they were merely investigating a potential safety hazard to the community when the animals charged. No mention of a broken lock, no mention of entering the barn. Just a carefully constructed narrative, painting themselves as brave protectors facing down wild beasts. It was pathetic, transparent, and utterly infuriating. But it also confirmed my suspicions entirely. They hadn't just peeked over the fence, they'd gone in. They'd broken the lock, crept inside, and obviously startled the bulls. Those bulls, confined in their stalls, unable to flee, would have reacted defensively to sudden intruders in their space. They wouldn't have needed to breach containment to scare the living daylights out of two clueless suburbanites. A snort, a stomp, maybe a head toss or a mock charge against the stall bars from a 3-0-pound animal in close quarters would be more than enough to send Peterson and Bernard scrambling for the exit like frightened mice. Bernard's limp and ripped trousers? Likely tripped and fell in his haste to escape the terrifying contained animals. Peterson's scratch? Probably caught himself on a nail or a piece of equipment fleeing the scene of his own crime. The image was almost comical, but the underlying violation wasn't funny at all. My first act was ordering a comprehensive security camera system, high resolution, night vision, remote access, covering every angle of the barn and the property line. It wouldn't undo the break-in, but it would ensure any future attempts were captured perfectly. My second act was planning a confrontation, not an angry outburst, but a calm, calculated encounter. I waited until the following evening. I knew Peterson often took a self-important stroll around the HOA common area after dinner. I parked my truck legally on the public street, walked over to the edge of the common area, and waited. Sure enough, there he came, Bernard limping faithfully, a few steps behind. I approached them calmly, phone openly recording audio. President Peterson. Bernard. I started, my voice steady. I had a visit from the sheriff's department yesterday. Peterson stopped, his eyes narrowing. Bernard visibly flinched. My barn was broken into. Heavy-duty padlock destroyed, pry marks on the door. Peterson puffed himself up. Yes, we heard about your unfortunate security lapse. Perhaps related to those dangerous animals you insist on keeping. It was a deflection. Funny thing is, Peterson, I continued, ignoring the bait. The break-in happened yesterday afternoon. Around the same time, several of your residents saw you and Bernard returning from the direction of my property looking rather distressed. Bernard, you seem to have hurt your leg. Bernard went pale, refusing to meet my eyes. Peterson stepped forward. We were inspecting a potential fence breach. Your bulls were acting aggressively near the property line. We were ensuring community safety. His voice was rising, betraying his panic. So you didn't break my lock? You didn't enter my barn without permission? I asked directly. Of course not. That's a baseless accusation. We would never, because the sheriff has a report documenting the forced entry. I cut him off smoothly. And I have photos of the damage, the footprints, the tire tracks leading back here. Breaking and entering is a serious offense, Peterson. Filing a false report about aggressive animals to cover it up probably isn't wise either. Peterson's face contorted. How dare you? Those bulls attacked us. They're a menace. It was the slip I needed. Attacked you? I pressed, letting a little steel enter my voice. Where? On my property? Inside my locked barn, perhaps? After you broke the lock to get in? The color drained from Peterson's face as he realized what he'd inadvertently admitted. He saw the phone recording. He saw the dead end. Bernard looked like he might actually faint. Peterson spluttered, tried to regain control. This conversation is over. Any further communication will be through the HOA's legal counsel. You're harassing us. He turned abruptly and practically dragged the limping Bernard away. I didn't follow. I didn't need to. I had the recording. I had the evidence. And now, I had his barely veiled admission. The game had changed. He knew I knew, and he knew I wasn't letting it go. This wasn't just about a broken lock anymore. It was about principle. It was about drawing a hard line against petty tyranny and the abuse of power, however small that power might be. Peterson had escalated this from a neighborhood dispute to a criminal matter, and I was prepared to respond in kind, strategically and thoroughly. My first step was compiling everything into a comprehensive evidence package. The sheriff's initial report, my detailed photos of the damaged lock, the pry marks on the barn door, the disturbed interior, the incriminating footprints and tire tracks. I included copies of all previous correspondence, Peterson's harassing letters and emails, my polite but firm replies citing property law. I transcribed the audio recording of my confrontation with Peterson and Bernard, highlighting his defensive bluster and inadvertent admission of being attacked on my property after the break-in occurred. I also obtained a written, signed statement from my friendly HOA neighbor detailing her observation of Peterson and Bernard's disheveled, injured return and the fabricated story they immediately started spreading. I got several quotes for repairing the barn door and replacing the destroyed lock with something even more robust, plus the cost of the newly installed, top-of-the-line security camera system. This wasn't just about repair. It was about prevention and damages. Next, I scheduled a consultation with a lawyer specializing in property rights and civil litigation. I laid out the entire timeline, presented the evidence package. Her eyes widened slightly as she reviewed the materials. Well, she said, leaning back, Mr. Peterson has certainly handed you a gift-wrapped case. She confirmed we had strong grounds for claims of trespass, vandalism, destruction of property, and potentially intentional infliction of emotional distress given the circumstances and the concern for my animals. More importantly, she illuminated a crucial angle, Peterson and Bernard's potential personal liability. She explained that while HOAs typically carry directors, officers, DO insurance to protect board members from lawsuits related to their duties, these policies almost always exclude coverage for deliberate illegal acts. Breaking and entering was clearly illegal. If Peterson acted without proper board authorization, which seemed likely, given his ego, or even if the board had somehow implicitly sanctioned this recklessness, the insurance company would likely deny coverage for any damages arising from the criminal trespass itself. This meant Peterson and Bernard could be sued personally for the damages, my legal fees, and potentially punitive damages. Furthermore, She pointed out the delicious irony regarding their alleged injuries. If they were injured while criminally trespassing on my property, they were responsible for creating the hazardous situation. My bulls, safely contained in their stalls, only reacted defensively because intruders broke in and startled them. Peterson's attempt to paint himself as a victim was legally DOA. Armed with this knowledge, we drafted a formal demand letter. It was addressed to Peterson personally, CCing every single member of the Serenity Meadows HOA Board of Directors. The letter meticulously detailed the facts: the ongoing harassment, the demands for illegal access, the criminal trespass and property destruction on Tuesday afternoon, the documented evidence, Sheriff's Report number cited, the photographic proof, the witness statement, Peterson's own contradictory statements recorded. It demanded full reimbursement for the barn door repair, the destroyed padlock, the installation cost of the new security system, and my incurred legal fees, totaling a specific, non-negotiable amount. It also demanded a formal, written apology from the HOA board, acknowledging the illegal entry and affirming my property rights, along with a binding guarantee against any future trespassing or harassment by any HOA representative. Crucially, the letter explicitly mentioned the potential for personal liability for Peterson and Bernard due to the likely exclusion of insurance coverage for illegal acts, and it firmly stated our intention to pursue all available civil remedies, including a lawsuit seeking compensatory and punitive damages, if the demands weren't met within 15 days. It also noted we would be providing all evidence to the sheriff's office and requesting they pursue criminal charges against the individuals responsible. But I wasn't stopping there. While the lawyers handled the formal demand, I took step 4, strategic information warfare, within the HOA itself. I drafted a concise, factual, and unemotional summary of the incident. It simply stated, an illegal entry occurred at the property adjacent to Serenity Meadows on May 11, resulting in property damage. A sheriff's report was filed. Evidence indicates potential involvement of HOA representatives acting outside their authority. This incident exposes the HOA and potentially individual homeowners to significant legal and financial liability, particularly if insurance denies claims due to illegal actions. Concerned residents may wish to inquire with the board regarding this serious matter and its potential impact on HOA finances and dues. I didn't name Peterson directly in this summary, but anyone who'd heard the rumors or seen him limping knew exactly who it implicated. I paid a high school kid $50 to discreetly place a copy of this notice in every single mailbox within Serenity Meadows late one evening. Let Peterson try to control that narrative. Finally, I followed up with the sheriff's department, providing them with the neighbor's signed statement and the audio recording of my confrontation with Peterson. I formally requested they escalate the investigation and consider filing criminal trespassing and vandalism charges against Peterson and Bernard based on the compiled evidence. The trap was set. All the pieces were in motion. Peterson thought he was playing checkers. He was about to find out I preferred chess. The delivery of the demand letter to President Peterson and the entire Serenity Meadows HOA board apparently had the impact of a well-aimed wrecking ball hitting a Jenga tower. According to my lawyer, who received a rather panicked call from the HOA's own legal counsel within hours, the mood shifted instantly from Peterson's defiant bluster to sheer, unadulterated panic among the board members. Their lawyer, upon reviewing the evidence package we included, likely advised them bluntly that Peterson hadn't just stepped over a line, he'd pole vaulted over it into a legal minefield, potentially dragging the entire HOA with him. The mention of DO insurance, likely excluding coverage for criminal acts, sent shockwaves through the board. Suddenly, this wasn't just about placating an annoyed neighbor. It was about protecting their own personal assets from Peterson's folly. Simultaneously, my strategically distributed informational flyer was working its magic within the community. Homeowners, already primed by the rumors and Peterson's increasingly erratic behavior, started calling board members, demanding answers. Why hadn't they been informed about a potential lawsuit? What exactly did Peterson do? Would their dues go up to cover his legal battles? The narrative Peterson had tried to spin, brave protector versus dangerous animals, completely crumbled under the weight of actual facts and the specter of financial liability. The HOA's insurance carrier, notified as part of the brewing legal storm, predictably launched its own investigation. Their preliminary assessment, conveyed grimly by the HOA lawyer to my lawyer, was that Peterson and Bernard's actions appeared to fall squarely into the intentional illegal acts exclusion category. Insurance might cover the HOA's defense costs up to a point, but it likely wouldn't pay a dime for any damages awarded as a result of the break-in itself, especially not punitive damages. And it certainly wouldn't cover Peterson and Bernard personally if they were found liable. The pressure mounted from all sides. The board, facing revolt from homeowners and abandonment by their insurer, convened an emergency closed-door meeting. Peterson apparently tried to double down, ranting about safety and accusing me of setting him up. It didn't fly. The other board members, seeing their own necks on the line, quickly distanced themselves. Peterson was effectively isolated. The final nail in Peterson's coffin came from the sheriff's office. Presented with the neighbor's statement, corroborating the timeline and the audio recording where Peterson essentially placed himself at the scene, complaining about being attacked inside my property after the illegal entry, the sheriff's office found probable cause. They formally charged both Peterson and Bernard with misdemeanor criminal trespass and vandalism. Facing criminal charges, civil liability without insurance backing, and a full-blown insurrection from the homeowners he supposedly represented, Peterson finally broke. His lawyer contacted mine, indicating readiness to discuss a settlement. The negotiations were swift. There wasn't much to negotiate. We held all the cards. The final settlement agreement was everything I'd demanded. The HOA paid for the full repair of the barn door, the cost of the destroyed high-security padlock, the complete installation cost of my new multi-camera security system, a significant upgrade, and reimbursed every penny of my legal fees. More importantly, the settlement included a formal, unambiguous written apology signed by every member of the HOA board, except Peterson, who was barred from signing, acknowledging the illegal entry onto my property by their representatives, affirming that the HOA had no jurisdiction over my land, and pledging unequivocally that no HOA representative would ever trespass or interfere with my property again. The financial compensation was substantial, but the apology and the guarantee were the real victories. As part of the settlement's conditions, and also facing immense pressure from furious homeowners in a subsequent official HOA meeting, both Peterson and Bernard were forced to resign immediately from the HOA board of directors and all related committees. Their reign of petty terror was over. Peterson later pleaded no contest to the trespassing charge, receiving a fine and probation. Bernard, ever the follower, received a similar deal. I watched them both shuffle out of the courthouse, stripped of their titles and their perceived power, looking small and insignificant. Back home, I supervised the installation of the final security camera, aimed squarely at the property line, where Peterson and Bernard used to lurk. The barn door was repaired, stronger than before, fitted with a new lock that would require military-grade explosives to breach. The bulls, entirely unaware of their role as unwitting catalysts for justice, munched contentedly in their pasture. Standing there in the quiet evening air, watching the sunset paint the sky behind my now fortress-like barn, I felt a profound sense of vindication. It wasn't just about winning, it was about restoring boundaries, about affirming the simple right to be left alone on one's own property. Peterson and his ilk thrive on pushing limits, on intimidating those they think won't fight back. But sometimes, when they push too hard, they run headlong into something immovable, whether it's the law, determined resistance, or just 15,000 pounds of very unimpressed bull. Remember, folks, know your property rights, document everything, and never, ever let a petty tyrant with a clipboard make you feel powerless on your own land. Sometimes, all it takes is a little strategic thinking, and maybe, just maybe, having a few thousand pounds of backup doesn't hurt either.